Good morning, everyone. Lots going on as usual. And do you know what happened last night while you were sleeping? Do you understand how big a deal what happened last night while you were sleeping is? They passed C10. C10 went through, sailed through, no problems at all. And there's so much stuff that happened as well. Yesterday we had the PHAC came to the House of Commons and they were supposed to deliver documents, and they did not show up with the documents. They showed up with nothing. So the Speaker of the House is pending. We're going to find out what happens next, but first we'll go through all that. So first, let's talk about C10 and what happened while you were sleeping. Just voted in favor of a motion to restore Section 4.1, says Dan Albus of Bill C10, which would exempt user-generated content from CRTC regulations. While Liberals, NDP, and Bloc are voting against it, it's Canada's Conservatives that are standing up for freedom of expression online. Yeah, but I don't know that it's going to work because, the NDP, Bloc, and Liberals are all voting against it, right? So this was last night. This is a Liberal member of Parliament, and this is how seriously he takes all of this. He's out having a sale while this vote is happening or something? I'm not sure.
I know, Mr. Speaker, just people say on Georgina Island, we got technical difficulties on Lake Simcoe, and I'd like to vote no. It's a crazy night out here, Mr. Speaker.
So he's voting no on Bill C10. Charlie Angus voted yes. He was like, you know what we've got to do? We're Liberal backbenchers, so we've got to make sure that this vote gets through for Justin Trudeau. I'll show you all of the votes as well. Michael Geist says Bill C10 heads to final vote in the House of Commons. Vote should start just after 1:30 a.m. and wrap around 1:45 a.m. as most Canadians sleep. Bill will head to Senate, where senators have said there is a 0% chance it will be approved this week before summer break. The problem with that is, and somebody else points it out on here, Justin Trudeau's been stacking the Senate with Liberals for a while. I think that sometimes party trumps trumps common sense, trumps the greater good. I'm not sure, but I'm not going to be very relaxed until the summer session starts and Bill C10 hasn't received approval from the Senate and then royal assent, etc., and becomes law. It is a stinky, stinky bill, and it's not good. Here's Charlie Angus. He voted for it. Where is he? Charlie Angus? Yes, you bet. Yeah, let's pass this. Let's pass this thing. Let's limit those internet alt-righters, right? It's incredible what they can feel is justified in this context. John Brassard says, breaking 1:31 a.m. As you slept, your freedoms took another hit from the Trudeau party. A C10 passed in Parliament, endangering free expression and net neutrality. You will also pay with increases in the price of subscription to digital platforms. Terrible, terrible. 1:05 a.m., Senator Batters says, is this the Trudeau government's idea of a democracy? Forcing through third reading in the House of Commons vote on the awful anti-free speech bill C10 in the dead of night using closure. Shutting down parliamentarians' free speech so they can shut down Canadians' free speech. Shameful. And yeah, very, very shameful. We've got other senators speaking out as well. Pamela Wallen speaks out as soon as I can get my mouse in line here. Oh, that's the wrong one. Here it is. Abusing parliamentary process to ram through a bill that restricts free speech and imposes censorship is dangerous, says Wallen. And yeah, I would agree with that. And as soon as I can find my mouse, sorry, everyone. Here is Alberta Guy. He says, well, it won't get through the Senate, so it's dead for now. I don't know about that. I don't. The idea that it won't pass Senate and we don't have to worry about it, I think is folly. I think we definitely have to worry about it. I can't believe that it got this far. I thought when Rhoda came out and said all of these non-voted for, silent and sneaky, what's the word? Non-transparent. They closed off the voting on anybody even knowing what was in the movements they wanted, and then none of the movements were actually brought into the committee through the correct process. So Rhoda said, you can't do any of that. That's all null and void. So during the third reading, they're voting one way or the other. And yeah, using these parliamentary procedure stuff to ram through a bill that nobody really wants, except for like the NDP, who's backbenchers of the Liberals, and the Bloc and the Liberals. And It's frustrating. It's very, very frustrating. There's nothing. It doesn't seem like there's a way out, because when you look at the power of the Liberals plus the NDP plus the Greens, that's a lot of Canadians. And I don't know if a lot of Canadians are on board with the removal of your free speech. But it seems like even in this minority government, making the argument has been made gauche, has been made like you're not allowed to do that. If you make an argument like that, you're probably racist. And it's like, well, hold on. And they've tied that very close together. They've done that on purpose. It's not a mistake with them making that association, tying those terms together. They don't like being questioned. And the way to stop questioning is to call names, right? And ad hominem attacks. Go look at my climate brawls. It's very funny. It's very funny. He stopped responding. Okay, moving into the PHAC. Yesterday, the Ian Stewart was supposed to come in and deliver papers to the House of Commons, and the PHAC is in contempt of the House of Commons. And Gerald Butts is weighing in on this. Disgraced Gerald Butts, right? Weighing in on this. He says denigrating public servants and public service has become a feature of our politics in Canada. It's not good for the country. It's interesting because it's like his buddy who's doing this, right? Like it's Trudeau who's doing this, although he's claiming to be the victim here. Public Health Agency of Canada, Ian Stewart is called before the House of Commons right now. And I think that it's funny that Gerald Butts still thinks that he's got like the clout to weigh in on Canadian politics, right? It's not good for our country. All right, Gerald, you're not good for our country, buddy. Andrew Lawton says the ceremony of this may seem absurd to some people, but this is important. When government agencies defy the will of Parliament, elected representatives, they put their political agendas ahead of the people they are supposed to serve. It must be noted, of course, that the PHAC and Ian Stewart are not going rogue here. They're taking the marching orders from Patty Haydu and the Liberals, who forgot that they too are accountable to the people. The problem I have with Lawton's statement here is, sure, they're accountable to the people, but what happens if all of the parties in the House of Commons are working for the same person or the same entity, and that entity is not the Canadian people, right? What happens then? What happens if Bernier has talked about the two wings of the Conservative and LibCon party, right? The Conservative CPC, Liberal LPC party. But what if it's more sinister than that? The title of the video today is "Something is Rotten in the State of Canada," and it seems like nobody is really interested in having the difficult conversations. It seems like it's party politics. It seems like it is a departure from listening to the citizens and acting on that. And now they're listening to handlers or whatever, but it doesn't seem like they're accountable to the people. It doesn't seem like they're accountable to their constituents, because, well, I mean, when constituents call, I call regularly, and you can't get through, right? Like the voicemail is filled up, and that's more true of the Ontario government than the federal government. But when these people are being threatened with being held accountable, make no mistake that the accountability is being kicked out of office. And if the agenda is being tended to by the Conservatives anyway, does Trudeau care? I think he wants out anyway. I think he's done with this whole thing. I think if he could have walked away and let Freeland do it, then he would have. But I think that they realize Freeland would be a complete disaster, right? Mom tone, head tilt. I mean, I hope they do it, because she would be a disaster. People would just be like Kathleen Wynne. You thought Kathleen Wynne was hated? Chrystia Freeland would be more hated. Nobody would vote for it. But more to the point, I think Justin Trudeau, if this is the exit plan for Trudeau, and they seem to be trying to kind of push O'Toole, he's not going to do anything different. He's not. He's on board for vaccine passports. He wanted the Emergency Act. It's all the same. They serve the same master. So the agenda continues. They're not accountable to the people. They're accountable to the agenda. And so long as the agenda continues, and the Conservatives, if they're running it better, and the Canadian public are more open to that, because it seems like more fiscally responsible, despite the fact that it's not fiscally responsible, well, so be it, right? Trudeau wins because he gets out. O'Toole wins because then he gets to be the successful leader of the Conservative Party. Conservative Party. It's not conservative at all. But they run the same. It gets you to the same place. It's like, do you want to drive in the Corvette or the Datsun? Where are we going? Grandma's house. Okay, like, you're going to Grandma's house. You can drive here in this or this, but that's where you're going. That's it. right? You're going to get out of the car and you're going to go to the destination. That's it. That's it. Maybe that's a bad analogy. I'm not sure. Read the article here. Let's go. PHAC President Ian Stewart reprimanded by House Speaker for failing to produce documents. The President of the Public Health Agency of Canada appeared before the bar at the House of Commons today, where he was publicly admonished by Speaker Anthony Rota for failing to turn over to Commons Commons Committee documents related to the firing of 2 scientists from the microbiology laboratory in Winnipeg. Rota called Ian Stewart into the House and began his reprimand by telling Stewart that the House of Commons and its parliamentary committees have defied powers outlined in the law that must be followed. The powers in question, like all those enjoyed by the House collectively and by members individually, are essential to the performance of their duties, Rota said. The House has the power and indeed the duty to reaffirm them when obstruction or interference impedes with its deliberations. As guardians of these rights and privileges, that is precisely what the House asked me to do today by ordering the Speaker to reprimand you for the Public Health Agency of Canada's contempt, refusing to submit the required documents. Stewart was also was ordered to bring with him the unredacted documents, demanded by the opposition MPs. The Speaker and said Stewart's lawyer had reached out to Rota's office earlier in the day saying that he would be unable to produce the documents. Calling someone on the bar of the House is rarely used procedure meant to publicly shame a person who has committed an offence against the dignity or authority of Parliament, according to the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition. Since 1913, it has not been used against a private citizen. It has been used twice in 1991 and 2002 to discipline MPs who had grabbed the ceremonial mace during heated Commons proceedings. It seems like there's more to that story to me. Opposition parties joined forces earlier this month to pass a motion in the Commons ordering PHAC to turn over all unredacted documents related to the firing of scientists Key and her biologist husband Cheng, who were escorted off the premises in 2019 and were officially fired in January of this year. The motion calls for the documents to be handed to the parliamentary law clerk, who would confidentially review them and redact anything that he felt would compromise national security or the ongoing police investigation. The motion specified that the Canada-China Relations Committee, after consulting with the law clerk, could choose to make public any redacted material. In defiance of the House order, the minority Liberal government instead provided the unredacted documents to the All-Party National Security and Intelligence Committee of parliamentarians whose members have top secret clearance and are bound to secrecy. Rota ruled last week that that sending the documents to the NSI-COP is not an acceptable alternative since it's a relatively new body and it's not a standing committee of Parliament. Rodriguez proposed 2 possible methods that would allow MPs to review the documents. The first involves striking an ad hoc committee of MPs, as was done during the Afghan detainee debate under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. MPs who took part in that committee were sworn to an oath of confidence in return for access to the documents. So unless you swear this oath of confidence, you can't see the documents. The second proposal was to have the law clerk and parliamentary counsel, assisted by national security experts, look at the documents together to decide what can be released. Conservative MP Michael Chong argued that the House could not stand by and let government refuse to deliver documents lawfully ordered by the House of Commons. Rota said he would take the argument into consideration and come back to the House with a ruling on what to do next. Yeah, it's not the Trudeau House of Commons. It is our House of Commons. It's representative of the people. If the government orders, if the House of Commons as a group, and it doesn't matter if it's the government, but a majority of the House of Commons orders the sitting government to produce papers, can that sitting government defy the will of that parliament? I don't think that it can. But anyway, Terry says, the Speaker of the House will deliberate on the ruling whether to order the Sergeant of Arms to go to PHAC to retrieve the documents ordered by Parliament. If he doesn't enforce this ruling, we're no longer a parliamentary democracy. This is huge. That's what I mean. If the Parliament isn't supreme over the current Prime Minister, then we don't have the system that we thought we had, right? I think that's kind of what it boils down to. So, but I don't think that we've had the system we thought we had for a while. I think we're in martial law. I think that something's happened that is outside of the norm to a degree that is making all of our leadership lock us in our homes, whether they want to or not. And want to or not, I think, is subjective. Whether they're good sense or science or whatever, it seems like they're coming up with excuses, for lack of a better term. I don't know what the proper term for excuses is, but it seems like they're coming up with bullshit excuses to kick the can down the road. And it seems like we don't have access to the proper legal checks and balances that we would normally have access to, despite the fact that the courts are kind of pseudo running. There's a situation where the reality is we don't have the rights that are basically that are inherent in us from our birth. We're being given those rights by the government in fits and starts, kind of, sort of, maybe, like given selective access to those rights. And that's not the system that we grew up in, or I grew up in. That's not the system that I agreed to partake in. But here we are. It doesn't seem to matter, right? And sometimes you have to deal with what's real rather than what you want, or what you want to be real, or whatever. What's real is like the full suspension of our rights and freedoms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's an Adam Skelly update that underlines this kind of, not well, but it makes me suspicious that this is the modus operandi. They're gonna try and drill down to look at one very specific aspect of the law, and the law will be within the scope and framework of the Reopening Ontario Act. So charter doesn't come into it, even though the charter informs and underpins the Reopening Ontario Act, right? Like all laws in the land have to comply with the charter, and then has to, if you want to violate that, has to comply with the Oakes test. So here's Skelly, and so this is going to, I think that our charter is suspended, and I think that we're operating under some kind of pseudo new kind of law that they just haven't rolled out yet. And there's a thing called past practice. If you do something in a union, if you agree that you don't work weekends, let's say, and it's in your union contract, and then you get like 5 or 6 people who they need to work weekends, let's just say, and they start working weekends. The management starts scheduling them on the weekends, and nobody says anything. And then 6 months later, you're like, well, what about this clause about no working weekends? We've got like 4 people who are working weekends. We'd like to negotiate, like something about that. And then they say, well, past practice, or we don't want these people working weekends anymore. Well, they say, well, past practice. We've been doing it for 8 months, and we've been paying them, and they like working weekends. So now we're negotiating with the reality of the situation. The reality is, staff here work weekends, and now we have to deal with that, right? The reality is the governing structure of what you expect it to be ruled under. You expect it to grow your family and grow your future under this system, under one system. It's like in Civilization where they switch the government. They don't tell people. It just gets done. And then all of a sudden, you have to deal with the reality of that situation. Maybe I'm not making it as clear as it is in my head, but we have to deal with the reality of the world that we live in, not what we think reality is, right? Okay. So Adamson says, we got the Crown reply factum. They ignored our expert advice, calling it superfluous and vexatious. They said that the argument on procedural issues, they staked their argument on procedural issues and left 1/3 of their allowable pages unwritten. Trust the science, am I right? No, it's a legal strategy. It's a legal strategy. And here's the... And the more I think about this, the more I'm like very worried about it, because this is the legal strategy that will then underpin the further removal of your rights, right? It's a legal strategy, I think. Here's their Crown prosecutors, and this is what they say. As soon as it loads, because my internet is wild today. In their factum, the respondents seek to impunge the entirety of Ontario's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The actual scope of this proceeding is much more limited. They're trying to limit the scope of the proceeding down to the only legal issue properly raised in this application is whether the respondents should be restrained from operating a restaurant in contravention of Regulation 8220. All of the respondents' many and far-fetched grievances about vaccines, PCR testing, hydroxychloroquine, stay-at-home orders, purported cost-benefit calculations, herd immunity, and the World Health Organization, among many other such topics, are superfluous to this proceeding, meaning they're outside of this proceeding. Indeed, they're vexatious. Indeed, they're saying they're meant to hurt this proceeding. The only pandemic measure that is properly at issue in this proceeding is the application of Regulation 8220 to restaurants. While the respondents are entitled to their opinion, their disdain for legislation is not a sufficient direct interest to meet the test for granting of standing to challenge in this proceeding the validity of the entire provincial legislative process to the COVID-19 pandemic. Regulation 8220 is not an unjustified restriction on any of the respondents' charter rights. The motion should be dismissed with costs. It's a legal strategy. If the judge looks at that and says, Sounds good. Then they've given them a viable out, a viable way to say, yeah, and you have to pay their legal costs. It's not good. I don't think it's good. Skelly doesn't seem worried about it, but I think that he not should be. But he says, no, you're not allowed to challenge the evidence. You must worship the chief science officers. The government has declared an emergency. The declaration of the emergency is good enough for the government. And so can the courts invalidate that emergency? They're going after the underpinning of the emergency. But I don't know if this is the right venue. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if it's the right venue to do that. But it seems like they're going after, you broke the health order, this very small regulation, right? 80-20. You broke that within this framework, so you lose with cost. And the rest of it doesn't matter because you're, pick any name that you want, alt-right, blah, 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 right? And so it's very concerning that we have to deal with the reality of the situation that we live in rather than what we want to believe. The outdated mapping that our brain has, that we live in a society where the law is knowable, equally applied, fair. You know, these things, throw them out the window. You don't live in a country like that anymore. You don't live in a country like that anymore. If you try and open your business and you try and hold the leadership accountable, you'll get the book thrown at you and you'll get your name dragged through the mud and you'll get called names and all sorts. That's the country we live in now. Not a shining beacon of democracy, but a former shell of itself.